Hello, everyone, and welcome. Today, we are going to go on a little journey through time and space to discover some of the things that happened as we moved from AngularJS to Angular and built Angular into what it is today. So this journey is going to start back in 2014. So this is me on the right. I worked at Google Glass for about 3 years prior to joining Google. So I was that kind of geek nerd. I thought wearable tech was really cool. It was going to change the world. And it seems like they're still trying. I was at Google I/O this year, and it feels like they're trying to reintroduce it. So we'll see what ends up happening with that. But I was an engineer that was focusing on a whole bunch of really interesting technologies. I had a period where I was actually recompiling Chrome from source every night. So just like taking the Chromium source tree, rebuilding it as a cron job, as well as building a lot of cool tech. So I was really excited back then about building games with OpenGL, and then building applications for mobile. If you remember 2014, mobile was still growing. It was going to be a big thing. I think it is now. I think people finally figured it out. Actually, it's gotten so big we've stopped talking about it. So I was on the pioneering side of like the Cordova Chrome side of things. And as a developer, as an engineer, I built a lot of applications with AngularJS. I loved AngularJS so much that I was actually an Angular expert as part of the Google Experts program, the Google Developer Experts program. Anybody? So we got a lot of Angular. We have 2 Angular developers here. Did you ever use AngularJS? Okay. So this will be a little bit of history for you, and then maybe you can take some lessons with you as we go. But in the world of AngularJS, 2014, 10/22, October 22nd in 2014 was a very important date because 2 of the Angular core team members, Tobias and Igor, got up on stage in Paris at the first big Angular conference in Paris, and they announced all the updates to the things that you know and love about AngularJS back then, which was basically, you're going to kill everything you know. Controllers, DDOs, $sign scope. So these were all technologies that were core to the experience of building a web application with Angular, and they got up on stage at a conference and said, all of these are gone. Not only just gone, but like a very morbid way of announcing this. They said every time they showed one of these gravestones, there would be like a really ominous tone that would sound, showing you like, these are dead. Don't use these anymore. And that was not really the best thing to do for the community, because for years after, they think, wow, what's going to happen? Google kills all their technology. They literally have gravestones. Like after this presentation, we've seen lots of websites pop up about Google, about hey, like Google kills all their products, and like you can have dates for everything, when they would kill it, how they killed it, all those sorts of things. What ended up happening was that the Angular team at Google, who I was not part of at the time, is they didn't think that AngularJS was the right solution. They thought, hey, we can build something better, which is something I think we all think sometimes. And we'll kind of, as we follow this journey, we'll see where that paid out, where that didn't actually pan out. But one of the things that I think is the first lesson here is that uncertainty kills motivation. Because at that time, at that conference, a lot of developers out there, they were very excited. They were using AngularJS, they really wanted to, what's the latest and greatest, they wanted to keep that getting better, keep improving and extending their skill set. But effectively what they were told at that conference was, no, all things you know are gone, you have to start over. And so as you think about this idea of uncertainty, whenever you're creating an application, building a component library, sharing with other developers, anytime you can bring certainty, or give even the perception of certainty, that's going to help. All right, so that was 2014. They said AngularJS, all the things you know and love are going to go away. We're taking all of your toys. Now we fast forward to 2015, where it's not ready. They are still building it. This was, in my mind, kind of a year of building. So they kept working on Angular 2, as they called it at the time. They kept making it better, they kept working on it, but they didn't actually release any production versions. Right? It was all behind the scenes, all pre-alpha, beta, that kind of thing. And so me as an AngularJS developer at the time, I was very skeptical. Right? I still needed to build applications, I needed to ship things to the web. One of my favorite websites that I ever built is my wife's my wedding website. Quick question for the audience, everyone here. Do you put the female name first or the male name first? Who says female name? Okay, what about male name? Okay, we couldn't decide. And so I ended up using AngularJS to build a website that would transform. So we had both the domain names, and whether you went to one domain or the other, it would use JavaScript, and it would flip the image using CSS transforms, and it would change the names. Problem solved, right? You can go to whatever website you wanted to. And this was like the perfect use case of like, hey, just throw some JavaScript on the web page, make it work without having to think about it. But then things continue. So I was an Angular expert. So one of the things that you do when you are an Angular expert is they will fly you around to different conferences to speak about that. I was really excited. So there was this conference called NG Vegas. It was the first Angular conference in Vegas. In Las Vegas, it was a beautiful hotel, beautiful place. And everyone kind of got up on stage and was talking about this new version of Angular 2. And I was up on stage talking about, okay, how do I use AngularJS to make cooler and cooler apps? What was that? Chrome Cordova app, CCA. So I use this web technologies and then ship an APK that actually lives in the App Store, just monetize it. But what I realized is the tone had actually changed. When people at this conference who were working were not thinking about AngularJS. They were not thinking of technology that I knew and loved for the reason I was there. And so, this gentleman by the name of David East, who was a developer relations for Firebase. I sat down with him and okay, David, what is going on here? Is this really a thing? And he's like, yeah, it is a thing. And so he kind of, I was very skeptical at first, because if you think back to 2014, some of these were in very recent then. We had a KDE transition, where there's a brand new version of the desktop environment of KDE. We had the Python to 2.3 transition, which I think is still going on. I still see Python 2 apps every now and then. And then even in 2011, you had this Node 3. So like, there were very recent moments where developers had been hurt by the products and communities that they relied on. And I thought, the AngularJS team's not going to do that. They couldn't do that already. But what kind of convinced me of was that there were a bunch of real reasons that they wanted to do this. So AngularJS was huge. It was one of the top and one of the first web frameworks that we used for building applications across the ecosystem. And so, and it had to be
I'm in 3H right now.
We're too many footprints. So for example, one of the footprints.
He explained to me that AngularJS had a dead battery. So there's one of the things that happens in AngularJS is the way that your components will communicate across the application. It was called the digest loop. So if you changed a variable in one part of your application, it would check the state of every other part of the application and update it. But then what would happen is one of those updates could trigger more updates. And so it would have to run the entire digest cycle again and again and again. And for many applications, people were using it wrong and ending up with hundreds or thousands of these extra loops just to do one change, right? One button click, one interaction. Also at that time, AngularJS had this modular system, but the web platform had evolved. This was the first time we actually had things like import, right? We had this idea of JavaScript modules that we could start to lean on. Also, if you've ever tried to mix two versions of AngularJS or two web frameworks in the same page, if they're hanging things on the global scope, it just falls apart, right? If you are referencing things on the global scope, everything falls apart because they collide, right? Oh, which version of jQuery is this? Which version of AngularJS is this? And so having everything on the global scope became an anti-pattern that kind of invalidated the entire framework in a lot of ways. Another of the new capabilities that was coming out was tree shakeability. So the idea that you could remove the parts of the JavaScript libraries that you were consuming that you didn't actually need. So if I didn't actually refer to a bunch of objects or methods, why are we bundling those and sending those out to the application? So all of these affected page performance and application performance. And so AngularJS applications were developing this really strong reputation of being slow. People didn't want to use it because, oh, now my website's going to be laggy. It's going to be like a terribly built mobile application. And so at that point, I was convinced that there was no going back, but I was still a little bit kind of skeptical as an AngularJS developer, like, this thing's not done. What am I supposed to do about this? And this is actually one of the most famous memes that we had, or that was at Google, which was, welcome to Google. There's two ways of doing things. You can do things the way that we used to do, that's deprecated, that you're not supposed to do because it's going away, or you can do things the new way that's not ready. And so for about 2 years, Angular was in this space, where the new version wasn't ready, so you couldn't choose that, and AngularJS was deprecated, so you couldn't choose that. So despite this, AngularJS continued to explode and grow in popularity, but at the same time, a bunch of new things started popping up, right? We've heard of Vue, we've heard of React, and these ultimately became very, very, very successful frameworks. And it was in this time when Angular had kind of invalidated itself as a choice that these started to flourish and started to become mainstream, because they had come in, they were fresh, they were new, they adopted those new ways of doing things, that modern web platform approach, and they didn't have that legacy of AngularJS. Some of these, I think the stats between 2014 and 15 for some of these was like 500% growth for Vue and React. So it was like massive growth that I attribute almost entirely to the fact that Angular had kind of left its community behind. They had deprecated the old thing and the new thing wasn't ready. And so one of the things the second lesson here is give your users a path. If they had waited to announce Angular version 2 until it was ready, until they had code you could consume and ship, it wouldn't have kind of ruined the community through this implicit deprecation that they had for 2 years, right? It took 2 years to do this. And instead of doing it behind the scenes, they invalidated the choice to use them and created a whole bunch of different competitors. All right, so now we fast forward to 2016. We're almost at 2 years of building Angular version 2. So I was working at a company called Trello at the time, and I got tricked by a recruiter. They called me up. They're like, hey, we've got a job for you at Google. And I said, no, I'm fine. I've got a job. Then a month later, they pinged me again, and they're like, hey, we've got a job at Google. I'm like, okay, well, what's the job? And they said, we can't tell you, it's confidential. And that sounded to me like the coolest thing on the planet, a confidential job at Google. And so I flew out to Mountain View. I went through all the interviews. And by the time I'd spent a couple days there, I was hooked. I knew I was going to join. But when it came out, I found out, oh, I'm joining the Angular team, which is an open source team, and I'm doing developer relations, which means that every word I ever say is going to be public, and everything I ever write is going to be on GitHub. It was the least confidential role across all of Google, but it still worked, and I loved Angular, and so I was happy to be there. So this is me in my Noogler hat. So again, I was not involved in the original decision to fork AngularJS into Angular, but then I was there before the 2.0.0, before Angular 2, as it was called, came out. And so it was actually a really interesting time because getting onto the team, there was almost this feeling of almost a death march, right? Like, it wasn't that bad, but a lot of the team members were like, we have to get this out. We have to go to production. We have to get 2.0.0 out. And like, but there were a lot of things. Things were still changing even as I was getting there in the months leading up to the release, right? The build system being System.js and the standards and the templates and the practices we were using were changing. The best practices were changing. So one of the things that happened in the last like 2 months right before release is they introduced the concept of ng modules. There was like a 140-page doc of why we need modules that was written, explaining how it needs to work, why it needs to work that way. 10 years later, we've kind of realized that this was all wrong. We don't actually need modules, so it's actually been removed as a mandatory feature of the platform. But this was the kind of churn that was happening as we were trying to get 2.0.0 out the door. But, and I'll also say the language that we used to talk about the versions was really, really awkward at the time. So Angular 2 was what the team had been calling it, right? For 2 years, you're working towards this 2.0.0 release, and so you just call it Angular 2. But that fundamentally breaks down when you start looking forward. So one of the things that the team had said is we're going to follow semantic versioning, which means every time in the future that we create a breaking change to the platform, we're going to increment that number. And so what does that mean? Are we still Angular 2? Or are we Angular 5 now? Are we Angular 6? Are you Angular 2 version 5.1.1? And all this became very messy. This became a bit of a problem. And so, or like what the other examples, are you the AngularJS 2 CLI? Because at that time, we didn't have locks between all the different packages within the Angular project. And so you could have versions all over the place, and nobody really knew what was going on. And so, and also if you think through the migration story, if you wanted to write a blog post about how to move from AngularJS or Angular 1 to Angular 2, that made sense. But once you had version 3 out, you don't want people to move from 1 to 2. You want them to move from 1 to 3. And so do you keep evolving that over and over and over? So we're going to have a little bit of a quiz here. What product is this? Anybody? AngularJS, yes. A little Minnesota sculpture for you if you remind me. And what product is this? It's Angular. No second Minnesota statue for you. So this was the compromise that we came up with, was we would call the old thing AngularJS, and we'd call the new thing Angular. And this was actually a perfect match for what we were seeing in the ecosystem, because when we were building Angular, that 2.0.0 version, we were using TypeScript, so every developer was kind of expected to use TypeScript, so we detouched from JavaScript. JavaScript was in all the old documentation, none of the new documentation, so we figured out this was going to be the least breaking thing, is just to drop the 2 and just call it Angular. So that when you're writing an upgrade guide, you call it AngularJS to Angular. When you wanted to write a migration guide, when you want to write a tutorial, you just call it Angular, and you stop worrying, and you stop thinking about that 2 versus 1 dichotomy. Right? This connects them. It still says Angular in the name, so you know that there's a connection here. But the names are distinct enough that you can actually differentiate which one you're using and which one you're talking about. So we had this big campaign out for a long time. It's just Angular that had a lot of success, but obviously you're never going to reach 100% understanding of those things because people don't care about what you say and what you think, right? But we fought really hard. So we created communication guidelines. We worked with our experts. One of the bigger challenges that we had was actually updating Google's knowledge graph, because within Google's understanding of the world, you know how back in the day when you Google something, it would pop up like that little card, just one card? Well, it knew that AngularJS and Angular were the same, were 2 names for the same thing. And there's no way for us to, like, we didn't have permission, nobody at Google is allowed to do this. It has to come organically from search results to split those two things. And so we had to go into the Wikipedia page and update it. We had to separate those pages, argue with a bunch of Wikipedia editors on whether or not they're the same thing or not. And you're like, I'm on the team. I wrote a blog post. Here's the reference. We had to update NPM scope, social accounts, documentation. So by separating these things, we allowed the community to like understand and talk about one as separate from another without it just being a version difference. But the big lesson here is naming and versioning matter. Right? Every time you name something, every time you come up with a version number, that says something about your product. One of the things I've seen a lot of companies do is they go to 1.0 or 2.0 very without a lot of thought. But a big release like that is always an opportunity to communicate and explain what you're doing, why you're doing, where your vision is, and how you're going to get there. All right, fasting forward to almost the end of 2016. We're now in September 14th, which was the day that we released version 2.0.0. So we actually had a big party at the Google campus. We we booked one of our internal rooms. We brought in balloons. It was a really fun day. We had decorations. And so this was finally the fulfillment of like 2 years of the team's work, and version 2.0.0 was out. Now, finally, we had a path that developers could use to move forward with Angular and hopefully be successful. And so we announced Angular 2.0.0. The name was proprioception reinforcement. We stopped naming releases because no one cared. But from my standpoint, that was actually the day the work began, right? You couldn't really do a ton of adoption and marketing and driving understanding until you had a framework people could actually adopt and try. So for me, the real work started that day. And if you think about the graph, we had a ton of users of AngularJS, but at that day, we effectively had zero. We had 0 Angular developers. And so we had a long way to go to build up to the community that we ended up building. And there were a bunch of challenges, right? We worked really hard to clarify this naming situation, but the team had been using these terms very loosely for 2 years. And so people were confused, right? There's still confusion to this day if you're not actually actively building on these things. The Angular team adopted TypeScript as the kind of canonical language for writing Angular applications. And that was scary for a lot of developers. This was the early days of TypeScript. Like when we did 2.0.0, the TypeScript adoption saw a giant bump up in their graph. Now they've gotten to a scale that like it dwarfs those original early days. But there were so few people using TypeScript that the Angular community starting to adopt TypeScript mattered to TypeScript. Like we were on the phone a lot with the Microsoft team working on that. There was probably these feelings of betrayal. Like some people thought, hey, like I relied on you for a thing and you took it away. What do you do about that? And so we had to re-earn that trust back. So there's this concept of Angular 3, which is almost a joke, is like, when are you going to do this to me again? How long until you pull out the rug from under me again, and now we have Angular 3, and I have to migrate? And then there was always this push that we had. So we wanted to get to a world where everyone in the community could stay up to date. So we could get everybody onto the new thing, and then keep them there, and keep them fresh, and keep them evergreen forever. And that was the vision. One of the ways that we ended up, things that we ended up building to do this was called ng upgrade. So it was a way that you could bootstrap the old version and this new version at the same time, and then you'd be able to share some of the state and events. Like, so you could have a component within an Angular application loading an AngularJS application. But this was used extensively by huge teams, but I will say it was never loved. It was a necessary evil that made things work, but it never actually solved the bigger problem of making it easier to get off of AngularJS or making it easy enough to get off of AngularJS. And so we were using Semver. So what ended up happening at Angular 3? Does anybody here know what happened to Angular 3? Why there was no Angular 3? So we were following semantic versioning. So theoretically, the first breaking change that we released to Angular would have been 3.0.0. But at that time, the packages weren't aligned. So we were shipping platform browser releases separately from router releases, separately from forms, et cetera. And because we deployed a feature bump to our router, the router was on version 3, which was compatible with version 2 of Angular. So it was an absolute mess. And so what we decided is, because we can't go back in scope and we can't deploy major breaking change to the router within the same major, we just moved everything to 4, and then from that day forward, kept everything in sync. So no one has to worry about which version of the Angular router you're running with Angular. Right? You said 12 and 16, I think you said? And so you're on 12 and 16 for everything, right? Okay. Yeah. But you don't worry about which version your router's on anymore, which is exactly the problem that this solved. So we burned that whole 3.0.0 namespace, and it was also nice because we fulfilled that promise of never having an Angular 3. But we had this kind of intense question that we had to keep our focus on this. How do we continue to evolve Angular without breaking the world again. And so there were a few different strategies that we ended up thinking about to do this. So one of them was we had a very well publicized 6-month release cycle. So every 6 months we would cut a feature release, we'd cut a new major, and then everybody knew that. You could plan for it, you could schedule around it, you could budget for it. Because one of the main adopters of Angular has always been enterprise, like large scale applications. And so having this pre-planned cycle made it much, much easier to figure out, okay, organizationally, how do we absorb all these breaking changes? As you move from 6 to 12 to 16, you kind of knew when the new versions were coming, right? We also focused on keeping any like innovations in what we call developer previews. And so the Angular team in the last like 2 years has gotten really good at this, where they'll release a new feature in developer preview, they'll change the API a little bit, and then it'll graduate out of developer preview. There was also a long-term support policy. So for years after a version of Angular was stopped being worked on, they would still maintain it for security patches, et cetera. And then there was also backwards compatibility for libraries. And so as you move to 16, 17, beyond, you probably aren't gonna have to worry as much about which version of your libraries you're using. You have to worry a little bit, but not as much as like, okay, let me go get an entirely new version of all my libraries every 6 months. And a lot of this came from the idea that Google itself actually moves fast. So within Google, there is this thing called a one version policy, which means for any dependency from any open project across all of Google, you can have one version. So that means there's one version of jQuery in use across all of Google, including legacy applications, everything, because they have a monorepository. And how it works is, so for example, if we on the Angular team deployed a change that broke someone else's application, if we break their tests, we have to fix it. And if we don't break their tests, they have to fix it. And so this idea of defensive automation is huge within Google, but it allows you to move very fast as a framework, right? You can change something, you can see how those changes affect lots of different applications. And so, for example, the reason that we were reasonably confident to go from one version of Angular to the next is that all of Google was always on the latest head. Like not even the latest version, but the latest commit. Every commit was validated against the entirety of Google. So over 100,000 different test suites, from Google Cloud to now things like Gemini. Angular is huge within Google. And by running all those test suites, we could be certain that changes weren't going to break the ecosystem. We even had this concept that I was trying to pioneer called a breaking budget, which is how much we can ship software at a certain rate, but how fast can you move the minds and spirits of developers? Right? So how much can we break Angular or change Angular to keep you engaged and to keep you with us so that you don't get lost? And so that was a budget that for the first few years I said we had zero. Don't change anything that you don't have to change because we're going to lose people and they're going to fall behind. So the big lesson kind of from all these pieces is plan for change, right? Like we knew the web was going to continue to evolve and form. And so if we plan for that, we have this release cycle, we have all these policies, we know that that's going to happen and we can anticipate and help it. But then how do you do this in open source, right? Like within Google, we can vet every product across all of Google is going to work with the new version. But how do you do that when you're an open source platform? And so the magic here actually came from a thing we added to our CLI called ng-add and ng-update. And the core idea behind ng-add and ng-update was that we wanted to invert the way that we normally updated dependencies. So when I used to update an npm dependency, I would update in my package.json, run npm install, and then see if it worked. Right? I would bump to the latest, and then maybe it's going to just work. Maybe it's not. And so I would go in, I would see it, I'd do some manual testing, do some automated testing, and see, oh, no, this didn't work at all. And then I would decide, okay, can I fix it? Let me go look for a migration guide. Let me go this. And so what the Angular team said is, we don't want to do that. What we want to do is, because we are the ones that understand the framework better than you, if we make a change, we want to actually make it automatic for you. And so if we need to rename a method, we need to add a parameter, remove a parameter, we can do that for you. And the funny thing is, because of how it worked within Google, we actually had to already do that for all these different applications, right? You had to update thousands of applications every time we changed the platform. So what they did is they externalized those as what we called schematics via ng-add and ng-update. So when you move from 6 to 12, the CLI knows how Angular has changed and will update your application for you. Only one version at a time, though, usually. And so lesson number 5, do it for them. If you are trying to keep your users up to date, you're trying to keep your ecosystem up to date, find ways to do it for them. Build tools. Like this inversion of responsibility is critical. And not only did ng-update work for Angular dependencies, it was designed as an open platform, so anyone could do it. So any Angular package, component library, et cetera, could, when you ran an ng update, it would say, oh, is there code that I can run that can update this? So RxJS use this, component libraries use this, grids use this, all these sorts of things. And I think we were relatively successful with that. So this was a blog post from Air France and KLM where they said, we upgraded 500 million annual users to Angular 7 in less than a day. Was your migration, sorry to keep pointing at you. Was your migration that easy?
I would say so.
Okay, good. Okay. Okay, we'll come back to that. And so this is why Angular was able to continue to evolve, continue to grow in adoption into the millions without leaving behind an ecosystem. If you look at the statistics, most Angular developers are on the latest major as of the release of the next major. So like that is a complete success story versus AngularJS where all these developers were abandoned, they had to go find somewhere else to go live. All right, continuing forward to 2018, there was a blog post from Pete Viken-Darwin, who is one of the former leads of the AngularJS project, and we basically said AngularJS is now stable, which was also saying it was deprecated, right? There's going to be a long-term support policy. So for 3 years, any security, any browser changes that affect AngularJS, we're going to go fix those. But in general, we're not going to make any more improvements to AngularJS. And I think everyone knew this was coming. We told them it was implied since 2014. But by finally saying it and saying, hey, we're going to continue to support it for 3 years, that gave people a feeling of, OK, it's going to be OK. One of the things I like to think about when I talk about software engineering is this idea of a silent majority. Most of your customers don't talk to you, right? You hear from the loud ones, you hear from the squeaky wheels. But like if you're building a platform, you're building a framework, you have any application with users, most of them are not on Twitter talking to you. They're not in your GitHub. They're not filing issues. They're not responding to your request for comments. They don't respond to surveys. And they don't attend your conferences. But you still have to think about them, right? If it's the silent majority, if 60% of your users aren't talking to you, how do you continue to represent them? And so like I would always try and be the person representing that empty chair in the corner of how do we think about that user and what their needs are, even when they're not here to advocate for themselves. So I think lesson 6 is always think about the users that you're leaving behind, because whenever you are building new software, you're going to lose some users. But if you're thinking about them and you're trying to do your best for them, they're going to have a much better time. You're going to keep them with you, and the whole ecosystem can move forward. One of the other things that I did when I was at Google was I worked with a company called Hero Devs to ship something called Extended LTS. Where we basically said, we're not going to touch AngularJS anymore, but if other people want to do that, great. And so we actually added a link on our AngularJS website out to this XLTS offering, where basically if you were a big company and you were stuck on AngularJS, you could pay that company and they would support it. And this solved a huge problem for us because we talked to enterprises every day, right? Like I ran a bunch of our enterprise relationships. So you had like Comcast and Walmart and T-Mobile, all these giant companies using Angular who still had large swaths of AngularJS. They're like, what am I supposed to do? We're going to migrate off, but it's going to take 2 years. And so by having a company that could come in and you just pay for support and patch security patches, et cetera, beyond what the Google team was willing to do, that solved a big problem. OK, we're going to continue the journey. So 3 years later, so 3 years after we said we're going to give you 3 years of LTS, we discontinued long-term support for AngularJS. And I don't think anyone was surprised. I don't think anyone was alarmed. This was one of the quietest announcements we made because it was expected. We'd done a very good job of setting expectations. Okay. Then we fast forward a little bit more into 2023, and they changed the logo. Because what they saw was, hey, we need to think about Angular in a little bit of a different way. We need to continue to evolve the platform because despite React and Vue being very popular, Angular was extremely, extremely popular, right? Millions and millions of developers. But the web had continued to evolve and change. The way that people talk about these technologies changes, right? Like when I hear developers talk about React, I don't anymore. I hear them talk about Next.js. And so there's these subtle shifts in terms of the feature set that you need to offer to be a successful framework or platform. And so the Angular team evolved. I was not on the team anymore at this point. But the Angular team evolved into doing that. And we're kind of, over the last 2 years, been in an Angular renaissance where things continue to get better in more than just kind of like minor incremental ways, right? There's brand new features like signals, zoneless, SSR that are allowing developers to solve problems easier or in a different way than they could before. They're continuing at that easy adoption and migration path, right? NG update almost always works. It works for me, and we'll figure out yours. There's this continued commitment to backward compatibility, right? Like you've got this idea of standalone components now. You've got a new control structure where the way that you specify if and a template has changed, but the old way still works, right? They are being very cautious, very slow, thinking about that breaking budget. And so this idea of slow and steady innovation without revolution, without forcing you to go back and rewrite all your code. And I would say Angular today is one of the most popular frameworks with over 3 million developers, but it's actually almost a secret. Because what you end up having is you end up having these large companies with thousands of developers writing Angular, and they love it because they can move from an engineer from one team to another team, and all the standards and practices are exactly the same. Whereas if you move from a React project to another React project, sometimes that can be a huge pain, right? You don't know what the standards are, you don't know what the dependencies are, you don't know what the packages are. And it's kind of proven itself at Google scale and continues to prove itself through this kind of huge number of websites. I still regularly, I built a Chrome extension that tells me what version of any tech website's using. And I still, every time I sign into any banking app, any airline, there's still Angular just sitting there. And so just to kind of summarize some of the lessons that we've talked about. So uncertainty for your users kills. You should always make sure about thinking about providing a path. Right? Don't just give them a fork in the road and say both of these suck. Naming and versioning matter. When you're naming something, think about not only what does it mean to you, but what is it going to mean to them. Plan for change. The world is uncertain, especially with AI being a constant disruptor that I'm seeing every day. I was very skeptical of AI until about a month ago, and I realized, oh wow, we're definitely not there today, but this is the direction it is headed, and similar to AngularJS, can't go back. Do it for them. Think about automation. Think about tooling that can make your users more successful, your other teams at your company more successful. And then always try and contemplate and think about those silent majority of your users, the ones that you're leaving behind whenever you make a big change. So earlier this year, I actually joined Hero Devs. So despite having that relationship with Hero Devs on the Angular team where you solved a problem for Google of like, hey, we don't want to deal with this support anymore, I finally decided to make the leap and I joined the Hero Devs team, where Hero Devs, our function is to solve that problem for open source projects and maintainers, right? We're here to help. So we offer drop-in replacements of end-of-life software. So like, there's so many companies still using AngularJS, and so we give them a version and sell a version that is secure, safe, compliant, et cetera. One of my favorite parts of my job since joining is working with maintainers. So if you know of open source projects out there that don't want to support older versions, or they're worried about this, or they need help getting their community to move forward together, that is something that like we do. And then we're always looking at reinvesting in the future. And to that point, we actually made a big announcement yesterday of our open source sustainability fund, where we basically allocated about $20 million to improve this end-of-life hygiene for open source across the ecosystem. This is things like, how do you communicate which versions are deprecated? What's your release policy? What's your deprecation policy? Because we think that by improving those things, all of open source can move forward together and more successfully. So I'm happy to take questions after, but if you need anything, if you know any open source maintainers that have this problem or any communities that are kind of stuck, that want help getting past that and moving forward, definitely shoot me an email. But thank you so much for attending. I don't have to stand up on stage. I can come down and we can have small group conversations if that's okay. Thank you, everybody.